that does is people can join the live stream before we're ready to go.
You moved your desk.
I did. Um, yeah, Elizabeth and I she was playing around with green screen stuff. We're trying to figure out how to make this look a little nicer since it's going to be a little more permanent. Um, you know, since we're going into May.
I'm just saying, I had to up Disney living room, but Chris nixed it. I'm just saying, it was good.
Trying to be a little more serious. Anyway, if you're joining on YouTube, hello, welcome. We got some people on Zoom. I know Paula was trying to get on Zoom, but something happened.
So I was supposed to help her, and I forgot.
Oh, well, that means you're a bad person. So there's that.
Yeah.
Hopefully on YouTube you can hear me if it's loud enough. We have a microphone on the way to help with that situation. Anyway, so tonight we're doing Daniel 6. I'm just going to go ahead and get started because I'm worried about the rain coming and you not being able to hear me. So last week we did chapter 5, and things are going to start to get really interesting here because chapter 7 and 8 come after chapter 4 but before chapter 5. So chapter 6, and we danced back before. In chapter 5 we went kind of back in time and Belshazzar talked about something that happened in the past, right? And then Belshazzar took over, and then the last we heard was that he died, right? He was slain by the Persians that came in, the Persian army that came in. So that's where we're at. So last week we did the writing on the wall. Belshazzar was killed. Darius became king. And you have to remember, the whole time we're talking about Daniel tonight, you have to remember this dude is in his 80s, okay? Because that is going to become so incredibly important when we get a little further down the road. But anyway, so here we are in chapter 6, verse 1. So Darius takes over, and it says, "It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer losses." All right? So the video is bouncy. Oh, I can't help that. That's me on the table, probably. So the satraps, 120 satraps, are like governors. I'm trying to think of it in terms that we can think of it and make it more normal in our mind, right? So Darius takes over, and the kingdom that he takes over is absolutely huge. So he appoints 120, what we would kind of today call governors. It's the closest thing we have, over the kingdom. And then Daniel was one of 3 that were kind of like vice presidents. So they're more powerful than the governor, but they're not as powerful as the king. And these 3 people were over the 120 governors, right? Verse 3 says, "Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom." All right? So what we get from this is when you are doing what God has called you to do, you will excel at it, right? And it doesn't matter what God has called you to do. If you are doing his will, you're going to excel because you are not the one doing it. He is. He's doing it through you. So obviously Daniel was the perfect commissioner, right? Obviously he was the best commissioner that's ever existed because he was where God wanted him to be and doing what God wanted him to do. Verse 4. The commissioners, the other 2 commissioners, and the 120 satraps, so the commissioners and the satraps, began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to the government affairs, but they could find no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Right? So he wasn't stealing from the honeypot. He wasn't mistreating people. He wasn't stealing from the king. He wasn't hiding anything. He wasn't lying about anything. Everything Daniel was doing was 100% on point. And they could not find any fault, right?
At 80-something years old.
At 80-something years old, that's right. So that 80 thing becomes very important a little bit. Then those men said, "We will not find any grounds of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God." So the only way, hey Blake, the only way that they could find any fault with him is in his relationship with God. Okay? And not that he had fault with his relationship with God, but that he would not make any mistakes in his relationship with God. Right? So the only fault that they could find, possibly to get him in any trouble whatsoever, was to use his relationship with God against him. In verse 6, this is how they did it. These commissioners and satraps came by agreement to the king and spoke to him as follows. King Darius, live forever. Right? So they butter him up. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors have consulted together that the king should establish a statute and enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or any man beside you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast into the lion's den. All right? So cast into the lion's den is simply exactly what it sounds like. Now, I don't know why kings had lion's dens back then or why it was so common, but they did. And so what they said is, if anybody bows down to anything or anyone other than the king for 30 days, then you get thrown in the lion's den. Verse 8. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it may not be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. Verse 9, therefore King Darius signed the document that is now the injunction. Here's the kicker. Once the document was signed, the law could not be changed no matter what. Okay? So it didn't matter what anybody did. It didn't matter what the king wanted to do. The law of the land was, once the king signed the document, it was law permanently and could not be changed. This becomes very important. Verse 10. Now when Daniel knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber he had windows open toward Jerusalem. Okay, so roof chamber is like the upper room. Okay. He continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God, as he had been doing previously. So he hears about this thing where it literally says, look, if you bow down to anybody but the king, you're going to get thrown in the lion's den. And Daniel says, nah, I'm going to keep praying to God as I always have. But here's the kicker, right? Look at that verse one more time. You look at the end of that verse. It says, kneeling on his knees 3 times a day. He's 80 years old. Okay, getting down on your knees at 45 isn't fun. I can't imagine what it is at 80, right? Kneeling on your knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks, right? Don't forget this. How long has Daniel been in captivity? Since he's 17 years old. How old is he? 80. Okay? Cheap math, 63 years, right? So for 63 years, he's been captive, held against his will, out of Jerusalem, away from his family, away from his home, everything. And to this day, he's still giving thanks to God because he's alive and cared for, and God is in his life. Kind of changes our perspective totally, right? So as he's kneeling and praying, in verse 11, the men knew that he prayed 3 times a day. In verse 11, they walked by the window. These men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and supplication before his God. They then approached and spoke before the king about the king's injunction. Did you not sign an injunction that any man who makes a petition to any god or any man beside you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast into the lion's den? The king replies, the statement is true according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. So remember, I told you it cannot be revoked no matter what, right? They answered and spoke before the king and said, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, like they needed clarification on who Daniel was, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. So we found this guy, we busted him, it was all a setup, but they did it.
They didn't waste a lot of time either.
No, they did not. They went that day. right? So they set all this up and then went that day knowing Daniel was going to go pray. Which also, we can stop and just look at that for a second.
Mhm.
On a personal level, how dedicated are we to reading our Bible and prayer? Are we so dedicated that literally everybody would know that that's what we're doing certain times of the day, right? They knew when Daniel would pray because he prayed every single day, 3 times a day, without fail. Verse 14, as soon as the king heard this statement, he was deeply distressed and set his mind on delivering Daniel, and even till sunset he kept exerting himself to rescue Daniel. So even though the king couldn't change the law, he spent the entire day trying to figure out how he could save Daniel, right?
Kind of awesome.
That is. Now here's what I want you to remember here, okay? Daniel was loved by Darius, obviously. If Darius was going to spend the day worried about Daniel. Daniel never did anything good for the king. Daniel only ever did anything good for God, right? Daniel's whole purpose in life was not to please the king. It was not to please the people around him. It was to please God. And by doing that, he actually pleased the people around him, other than the people that were jealous and mean and rude and whatever, right? You're always going to have those people in your life. But by pleasing God, you please the people around you more than you would if you just tried to please them. And I think we forget that, and we're as a society, we're afraid to stand up to people and to say things to people, you know, in a loving way, but to say things to people and remind them that God comes first. And instead we try to placate people and make them feel better. Like there was this, I commented on a post this morning that I read online about a boy who was separated from his father during quarantine because his father's mother was separated because his father was being physically abusive to the spouse. Okay? Not a good situation. Luckily the boy was with the mother. The thing that got me though was the boy wanted to paint his nails and his dad would never let him paint his nails. So his mom has a video of him painting his nails, and she posted this whole thing about how it's, you know, she's painting his nails even though his dad wouldn't approve because it's what he wants and makes him happy. Okay? Look, I have no problem with the kid wanting to paint his nails. I'm sure when I was a little boy, I let my mom paint my nails. In fact, I know she has pictures of me wearing her shoes, right? Running around the house in high heels, you know, at 5 or 6 years old, whatever. It's totally normal. My problem with the situation is the idea that whatever you want makes you happy is good. We have to get away from that. That is not how God works. And you look at Daniel and you're like, this dude has been captive since he was, we guess, about 17 years old. He has not done a thing that has made him happy. His whole life has been complete misery, serving king after king that keeps putting him in these horrible situations. We know he's about to be thrown in the lion's den, so it's not like we're shocked at what's coming, right? His friends have been thrown in a furnace. I mean, he's had all sorts of stuff happen to him. None of it has been about his joy, but he's still serving God and still puts him first.
Yep.
So we as a society, we've got to get away from that. You know, you don't want to be rude to people, but, you know, like I replied to this lady and I was like, I think it's great that you're supporting your kid and, you know, painting his nails is fantastic. There's nothing wrong with that, but please do not teach this child that do whatever you want because it makes you happy. And what I said to her was, and I probably regret this a tiny bit, but it was to get my point across. I said, what if he grows up to be like his dad because he wants to? And my point was, right, if his dad was abusive to you because it made his dad feel better or made him happy, and you're raising your son to do whatever makes him happy, he might grow up to abuse women too. Right? And it was just to make a point that you can't live your life like that. Anyway. So, you know, these lessons that come out of Daniel are absolutely amazing, and it actually can even go to today with, you know, this stupid quarantine thing. Not stupid, it's needed. But the quarantine thing, you know, Georgia just got extended to April 30th. He's going to end up extending it again before April 30th comes. I know for a fact. And a lot of people are like, I'm going to the beach. I'm going to do whatever. I'm living my life. I'm having summer. No, stop. Because you're doing what is fun for you, what feels good for you, and you're actually going to end up damaging, you yourself or other people. Anyway, long side note. I know, I apologize, but y'all know me by now. We do that all the time.
Another thing I was thinking about when you finished up with him being brought before Darius, he never even had to defend himself, nor did he even want to.
Right.
I think that's beautiful because we're so quick to defend ourselves when we're, just like you said, his entire life's been about God. I just think that's an awesome point that he didn't even defend himself.
Yeah. So the king spent all day, right, trying to figure out a way out of this. In verse 15, it says, Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Recognize, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians, that no injunction or statute which the king establishes may be changed. Verse 16, And the king gave orders, and Daniel was brought in and cast into the lion's den. The king spoke and said to Daniel, now listen to this, Your God whom you constantly serve will himself deliver you. So by Daniel being so faithful, some, not all, because the king has to come to his own relationship with God, right? We talked about this last week, I think, or maybe the week before, or Sunday or something, where, like if you're a parent, you take your kids to church, that doesn't mean they're saved, that doesn't mean they have a relationship, but they're learning how to, right? So by Daniel being so faithful, he's actually rubbing off on the king, where the king recognizes, hey, your God will save you. You're so faithful and you're so true to him, there's no way that he won't get you out of the situation. And obviously he's heard about Daniel from the previous kings and everything that has gone on. Now the other thing we have to remember, and I'm going to get into this in a minute, but on verse 17, Daniel's tomb, we will call it, was covered with a stone. Okay? That's very important. We're going to come back to that though. Verse 17, a stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet rings of his nobles, so that nothing would change in regard to Daniel. Nobody could rescue Daniel, right? And the point of putting the stone over top was to accentuate the miracle, right? When God does a miracle, there's no question that God did it. If you've ever had God do a miracle in your life, you know for a fact God did it. It may not be apparent to people on the outside, but to you it's apparent. When God does miracles in the Old Testament, because he is in a witnessing phase, right? We are the ones that have to witness now, but back then in the Old Testament, God was in a witness phase. He made sure that when a miracle happened, you knew God was involved, okay? So they sealed it with a stone, and then with the signet rings, I'm not sure what a piece of wax on top of the stone would do, but I guess it just proves that the king was there and knows it's sealed. Verse 18, Then the king went off to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. So we know the king loved Daniel. He was worried, right? Now, I want to go back to this one more time. Daniel was just dropped into a lion's den, right? Now, when we say lion's den, you got to think kind of like the furnace. It would have been a cutout in a hillside with a door, and the top would have had a vent, right? How old was Daniel? 80 years old, okay? Dropped, not lowered, not placed, not gently lifted, because the lions would eat you if you went in there. He was dropped into the lion's den. 80 years old. Okay. Verse 19, the king arose at dawn at the break of day and went in haste to the lion's den, right? So the king gets up and starts booking it. He's like, I'm flying to the lion's den. I want to get Daniel out as soon as I can. I hope he's alive. He obviously,
he was like in his 60s, wasn't he?
Yeah, something. I'm not 100% sure how old he was himself. But what's funny is obviously there's a glimmer of faith there that Daniel's Lord or Daniel's God would have saved him, because the king's like, I'm booking it there. If he didn't have a glimmer of faith, he wouldn't have wanted to go, because he wouldn't have wanted to see the blood and guts and whatever was left, right? Verse 20, when he had come near to the den, When he had come near the den to Daniel, he cried out with a troubled voice. The king spoke and said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God. Look how he's described. That's so beautiful. If I ever was described as that in my life, it would make my life, right? Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you constantly serve, been able to deliver you from the lions? So he cried out with a troubled voice, right? A little bit of doubt there, but a little bit of faith at the same time. Daniel spoke to the king and simply says this, O king, live forever. Remember the sermon on Sunday? It was on the 6th commandment, thou shalt not murder. If somebody threw you into a lion's den, would you not want to seek revenge? Would you not want, I don't know, something to happen to them? Daniel's response is, hey buddy, no, I'm fine. I hope nothing ever happens to you. I hope you're okay.
He knows revenge is God's.
And revenge is God's, that's right. Right? So at 80 years old, dude's been thrown down a hole into, I don't know how many lions, let's just say 4, let's just pick a number, right? 4 lions are in the den just roaming around, eating anything that shows up in there. Daniel gets dropped down there 80 years old and spends the night in there. Guarantee you they didn't have the lamps lit or the torches lit. So not only is he in there, he's in there in the dark. So you're just sitting there like, right? Knowing that cats can see in the dark and all that garbage. He goes on, he says, my God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king, I have committed no crime. So he says, look, God saved me because I'm in this position because I'm serving him. And while I was serving him, I never committed a crime against you. So you can't throw any shade on me, right? The king was very pleased, happy that Daniel was alive, and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatever was found on him because he had trusted in God. Now I want to hit on this, right? So no injury had been found on him from the tigers. No injury had been found on him from being thrown down the hole. Okay? No injury had been found on him psychologically or mentally from spending a night in a lion's cage. Now, I want to be very clear about this. I guarantee you that there was some psychological or mental issues taking place during the night. Okay? It doesn't matter how much faith you have, you would still be scared if you were forced to sleep in a lion's cage or lion's den with lions roaming around.
That's a good thought. I didn't think about that.
That were kept hungry on purpose, right? The only time these lions got fed was when people got thrown in there. The thing to remember is, and it's good for a time like this when people are starting to suffer from, like I know, this is not bragging or trying to drive people crazy, but if I lived in New York City and was stuck in an apartment for 30 days, or going on what will end up being 45 days or however long it'll be, I cannot imagine the mental strain and anguish it would have, especially if you're stuck in a small, Manhattan apartment with your family, right? We're lucky we live, most of us live out in the middle of nowhere and we can go do whatever we want. I mean, even Reisdville, we all live in houses. There's no apartments, so to speak, in Reisdville. You can go outside, you can do whatever you want. I live on 20 acres. My life hasn't changed, other than I can't go to church, right? The mental suffering and anguish that must happen when you're thrown overnight into a lion's cage has to be devastating. But here's the key. God will bring you through it. And by bringing you through it, when he does, there will be no damage at the end. So if you're struggling right now because of the quarantine and whatever's going on, it's fine. That doesn't mean that God doesn't have you. It doesn't mean that he doesn't have this figured out. Okay? You might be suffering, but keep the faith, because when it's over, there'll be no permanent damage. You won't be hurting or mentally messed up in the head permanently. It'll all go away. No physical damage.
Perfectly.
Do what?
that ties perfectly with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown in the fire, because I mean they didn't even smell of smoke,
Absolutely.
much less than actually being hurt. They didn't even smell of smoke.
Right.
So it's perfect. There was no injury at all.
And look at the thing. The injury was not found, so there was no permanent injury, either mental or physical, right? Was not found, and the reason why is simply because he had trusted in God. That last bit of that verse is the key, right? So to survive anything, you have to do two things. Okay? Because trusting God comes in two parts. We forget this. Usually we trust in God when we're down and out and we have nowhere else to go. That's the easy time to trust in God, right? To say, I can't fix this, so God, I'm just throwing it over to you and hope it all works out. I got to trust in you because I got no other choices. You got to trust in God when you have choices. You got to trust in God when you're just doing your everyday life, right? Daniel trusted in God even though he's been in captivity for 60 years. Every day of his life he trusted in God, not just when he was in the lion's den. So he made it through unscathed because he trusted in God. How did he trust in God? He was doing the will of God his entire life, as best as he could. Daniel's not perfect. Don't get confused, right? There are markers in here, verse 17 is one of them, that he is a reflection of Christ that is coming, and I'm going to get back into that in a minute, but that does not mean that he was perfect. It means that his whole life he trusted God because he did the will of God. That's what kept him safe. Verse 24, we get back to the same cyclical thing that we keep having with all these kings. It's like, would society not just learn? But again, we're living in it now. You have a whole bunch of people that are returning their faith to God because of the events that are happening, right? You have a whole bunch of people right now that are, doing the crosses in the yard, right? I think it's great. We have one in our yard. I know the church site, Elizabeth posted something on church site, I think, about it, whatever. I think it's great. It's like Christmas tree, but it's an Easter cross. But I know for a fact that there are people putting Easter crosses up that haven't stepped a foot in church in 5-10 years. It's absolutely fantastic. But keep going, even after all this is over, right?
That's right.
Don't stop. That's part of doing the will of God, the things that keep you safe, right? So look at verse 24. The king then gave orders, and they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, and they cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. Okay, not the greatest Christian moment.
That's hard.
Okay, it's harsh. Remember, this is Old Testament rules, so harsh stuff happens. Okay, the king has not quite got down the whole Jesus thing yet, but look at the miracle accentuation that is taking place. Not a thing happened to Daniel. What does it say? It says, those men who had maliciously accused Daniel. So we don't know if it was all 120. We don't know if it was a team of 10. We don't know how many it was. But not only them, their wives and their children, right? So let's just say it was 4 guys who got together and said, we're going to bust Daniel out, okay? And each of those 4 guys had 2 children, okay? That makes 12 people now. And then each of those 4 guys also had 1 wife. That makes it 16 people, right? So let's just say just 16 people got thrown into the lion's den.
Probably more than 4 lions if they
Maybe.
before they hit the ground.
Maybe. They had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all of their bones. Obviously, the miracle has been made. Boom, you know it's God, because these lions were so daggum hungry and angry and whatever that 16 people were thrown in the hole at a minimum, right? I'm going to say 16 at a minimum, were thrown in a hole at a minimum and did not even reach the ground before they were destroyed by the lions. Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language. This is key, right? Wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in the land. So not just his kingdom. He wrote to everybody in their language, may your peace abound. That's pretty much Jesus, right? Like that's what Jesus wants. He wants your peace to abound. He wants you to be peaceful. He wants you to be in the will of God. God wants us all to be cared for and taken care of, right? You see a change has happened in Darius the king because of Daniel's actions, right? All of a sudden now the king is starting to act not like the guy who just threw a family down the well, the lion's den, right? But he's starting to act like somebody who kind of gets the idea behind God and his love for us. But look at what he goes on to say. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. So he didn't have a name for God yet. They just called him God of Daniel. Now listen to this. This is the proof of salvation of the king. You ready? He is the living God and enduring forever. His kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. That is the absolute greatest definition of God that you will find from any king at any point in time
100%.
in history. Right? It ends, it says, so this Daniel, I love how it says this Daniel like there were 84 others, this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Okay. I don't want to get ahead because I don't want to ruin next week because next week's really cool. Darius the king's reign ends and Cyrus the Great's reign begins, and Daniel is still around. This man, I mean, you talk about, he should be a saint. I don't know if he is or not. I don't do the whole saint thing, but you know what I'm saying, right? He is still there leading people to God. It's absolutely unbelievable. But we're almost done, but I want to go back and I want to show you this because it's very important for Easter coming up. So Daniel is a foretelling, okay? And I got to be quick because I hear the rain starting and I can see the lightning. Daniel is a foretelling of Christ coming. All right, and I want to show you because you get it out of verse 17. It's very cool. So Daniel was remember, Christ didn't come until God was done trying with us, right? So God had Adam and Eve. They kind of messed it up. Kind of. They really messed it up. God had Cain and Abel. Cain messed it up. God had Moses and Aaron. They messed it up. God had Joshua. He messed it up. God had Samuel. He messed it up. God had Daniel. He messed it up, right? Keep coming. And finally God says, okay, the only solution is for me to do it myself, right? But Daniel was a foretelling of Christ. Look at verse 17. A stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den. A stone was brought and rolled in front of the tomb. The king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the signet ring of the nobles. Right? The rulers of the church at the time, the rulers of the temple at the time, sealed Jesus in his tomb using the Roman soldiers to do the dirty work. So that nothing would be changed in regard to Daniel. So that when Jesus walked out of the tomb, you knew for sure it was God, without question. Right? The other thing to remember is Daniel went into the lion's den. The lion's den would not be a fun place, right? No matter what. I don't know if y'all, hang out with lions much or petted them or went swimming with them or fed them, or, right? I'm not interested at all. I don't trust cats, number one. And number two, lions are huge and they eat people. Christ went into a lion's den times 1,000. Remember, he went into hell for us. Daniel came out of the lion's den unscathed. Jesus came out of the tomb unscathed. Daniel served God and the will of God above everything else. Jesus masterfully, without mistake, served God above everything else, even his own life and his own safety. Perfect correlation for Easter.
Without a doubt.
Okay, so we're doing some stuff. My wife is helping me. We're trying to make things a little nicer looking for Easter. As you see, I have a new background today. It's not that weird panel. It's just some horrible white panel, but we're working on it. Hopefully y'all will join Easter Sunday. It'll be good service, and we're getting close to being able to figure out how to do Logan Live and me live, even though Logan's doing pre-recorded stuff right now. We're close, and that's not going to happen Easter Sunday, but it may happen shortly after. So I look forward to seeing you Sunday. Don't forget, I have not missed a Good Friday service since I started church. I don't think. It may have been 1 or 2 years we didn't do it for some reason or another. This Friday is Good Friday, and I'm gonna do something. I'm gonna do some kind of live stream. I know it's short notice, but I'll put it on Instagram. I always like to do something. I hate to not do it, but don't forget that this Friday is Good Friday. Okay, this Friday is the Friday that Jesus died for you, and He did it before you were even born, or before your parents even knew you were going to exist. Don't blow off Easter just because you can't go to church. Okay, get dressed up Easter Sunday. Take pictures with the family. Do your little Easter egg hunts if you have kids, or if you're an adult and you like Easter egg hunting. Go for it. Do it. Celebrate however you know how. God loves you. He's amazing. And it's still Easter, even though we can't all be together. Okay? I thank you all for joining me tonight. Those of you on live stream, thank you for joining. I will post on Instagram and on the website about Friday night. It'll be at 7 o'clock. It'll be short, but it's just something I want to do. I love y'all. Have a great night. Stay safe. Stay out of the grocery stores. Stay home. Stay clean. Be careful. Spray your mail. Lysol your mail. Do all the things you need to do to take care of yourself. I'll see you Friday or Sunday morning.